So I'd like to invite you to what is probably the first of a whole series of short webinars with Dr. Gordon Edwards. Many of you know him as the president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Today's webinar is all about thorium. You know, all of us are hearing, if we're managing Facebook pages or doing campaigning around nuclear power, there's always people, nukeheads I call them, who are bringing up the potential of thorium to save the day. And I'd like Gordon to just give us a 15-minute overview. What is the debate about? Is it real? Is it fake? And then we'll go to your questions, and Susan will speak on your behalf and ask Gordon 15 minutes worth of question and answer. And we're recording this. So over to you, Gordon.
Well, thank you very much for everybody for turning out, and Angela for hosting this, and Susan and Jewel for helping us with the questions and so on. What we're talking about here are thorium reactors, and what is the role of thorium as a nuclear fuel as it's described. I'm going to give a little bit of history and a little bit of modern explication of what we're talking about with thorium reactors. First of all, when radioactivity was discovered back in 1896 in Paris by Henri Becquerel, he discovered that there were two primordial radioactive elements, two primordial radioactive ores. One was uranium and the other was thorium. So from the very beginning, uranium and thorium were on the same track in terms of scientific interest. They both emit spontaneously powerful atomic radiation particles and rays that are capable of, for example, fogging a photographic plate, even one that is shielded from light. And that was the discovery of the energy given off by these rocks. When you put one of these rocks in a cloud chamber, you can see an absolute avalanche of energy coming off that rock in the form of tracks of particles that are escaping from the rock. And it's amazing to realize that that has been going on constantly for millions and millions and millions of years. And it was an absolute mystery to people how there could be so much energy in just a rock, and how it could be so virtually limitless. It just keeps pouring off, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. With radioactivity, there's no way to shut it off. There's no off switch. And that's why we have a radioactive waste problem. When we create new radioactive elements that have a long life, we can't shut them off. And the only thing we can do is try and keep them out of the environment of living things permanently. A tough task because, of course, human civilization is not old enough to look after these materials for millions of years. It was not until 1939 that it was discovered that there was a trigger that could be used to create a chain reaction. And that is the basis of the atomic bomb, and that's the basis of nuclear energy. If you can somehow find a way of liberating this amazing energy suddenly in a short space of time, then you can either destroy cities or you can power cities with electricity, for example, depending on how you use that energy. And so atoms for war and atoms for peace were considered to be a kind of a Jekyll and Hyde combination. And in Canada, we wanted to promote the peaceful uses rather than the military uses. Nevertheless, the first use was as a military weapon because the discovery of fission was right during the beginning, the launch of the Second World War. And the fear was that Germany might develop a nuclear weapon and use it to control the world through terror. And the purpose of the Manhattan Project was ostensibly to develop an atomic bomb of our own so that we would at least have a counter threat and be able to block Hitler from using nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, the only person who resigned from the Manhattan Project when it was discovered that Germany didn't have the atomic bomb was the man who founded the Pugwash, Joseph Rotblat, the Pugwash conference, which was dedicated to trying to figure out how to rid the Earth of all nuclear weapons. a goal which is still far from being attained, even though we have a UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Canada has not signed it. None of the NATO members have signed it. And of course, the superpowers have not signed it. But a lot of nations in the world have signed it. Now, just in 1939, the fissioning, the chain reaction was discovered. There's only one material that is found on Earth that can be used for a chain reaction, and that is uranium-235, a rare kind of uranium. Only 7 atoms out of 1,000. When you mine uranium out of the ground, only 7 atoms out of 1,000 are uranium-235 atoms. Those are the ones you need to create a bomb or to fuel a nuclear reactor. So consequently, to make a bomb, you have to increase the percentage of U-235 to a great degree, and that's called highly enriched uranium. Once you can enrich it beyond 20%, hopefully up around 80% for the Hiroshima bomb, and nowadays they consider 90% to be the ideal for weapons-grade uranium. Meanwhile, it was discovered in 1940 that while you're fissioning the uranium-235, the neutrons are flying around inside the reactor and turning the non-chain reacting uranium, which is called uranium-238, transforming that non-reacting uranium into a new substance called plutonium. And plutonium is even a more powerful chain reacting element than uranium-235. It's a human-made material. You don't find it in quantity on Earth, but you can manufacture it, and it is manufactured in all operating nuclear reactors that are fueled with uranium. Well, in 1940 also, it was discovered that not only does uranium-238 react with neutrons to become plutonium, a weapons-usable material, and those two substances are the backbone of the nuclear arsenals all over the world today, highly enriched uranium and plutonium. But it was known as early as 1940 that if you took a non-chain reacting material, which occurs naturally, thorium, it's 3 times as abundant as uranium. It's also a radioactive ore. And if it's subjected to neutrons, it changes into a human-made isotope of uranium called uranium-233. Now, the odd numbers are important here. It turns out that the odd-numbered isotopes are much more likely to be chain reacting than the even-numbered isotopes. So we have in nature uranium-235, uranium-234, and uranium-238. It's a mixture of those 3 in natural uranium. Only the U-235 is chain reacting. When you produce uranium-233, it is very chain reacting. And it's 100% enriched the moment it's made because it's not contaminated with any other isotopes of uranium. So you don't have to enrich it. You just have to take it out of the reactor after it's been created through neutron bombardment, and you can immediately use it, theoretically, in a nuclear weapon, or if you were inclined to use it for peaceful purposes, you could use it as fuel for new nuclear reactors. And that's what thorium reactors are. Thorium itself is not chain reacting, so you can't fuel a reactor with thorium. You put thorium into a reactor and turn it on, nothing happens. So you have to have a fuel that is chain reacting to get the thorium going. And for that, they have to use either enriched uranium or plutonium. Now, that means you have to produce the enriched uranium or the plutonium to be able to start a thorium reactor. Already you're on the road towards making weapons-usable materials available right from the outset. So you can't even start a thorium reactor without producing weapons-usable materials. That has to be used to spike the thorium. You got to blend the fissile material, as it's called, with the non-fissile thorium and put it into a reactor and then turn it on and let the fissile material do its work with the chain reaction and let the thorium turn into uranium-233. It's kind of like cooking the thorium into uranium-233. But then how do you get the uranium-233 back out again? Well, the chain reaction produces fiercely radioactive nuclear waste, high-level radioactive waste. You got to take that fuel out, and you have to somehow get the thorium out again. Well, that's the same problem with getting plutonium out of spent fuel. How do you get plutonium out of spent fuel? Turns out you can't get it out without destroying the solid fuel bundles, either by dissolving them in an acid or putting them into an electrometallurgical device called pyroprocessing. But however you want to do it, you've got to destroy the solid fuel bundles to get at the plutonium or to get at the uranium-233. And that means reprocessing is essential. You can't have thorium reactors without reprocessing. Now, reprocessing is the dirtiest aspect of the whole nuclear fuel chain. When you go from mining, which is very dirty in itself, producing millions of tons of radioactive waste from uranium milling, which is going to be around for hundreds of thousands of years as a hazard. But when you get to the plutonium extraction or the uranium-233 extraction, what we call reprocessing, then you have to liberate all of those hundreds of human-made radioactive elements in the spent fuel. And so that's the major drawback of thorium reactors. Now, thorium reactors are not a scam. They've been known for a long time to be work. As a matter of fact, the very first electricity producing reactor ever built in the United States was called the shipping port reactor. And it had 3 fuel loadings. And the first fuel loading was highly enriched weapons grade uranium with a blanket of natural uranium. The purpose of that was to fission the highly enriched uranium and let the blanket of uranium, natural uranium around it generate plutonium. So right from the beginning, it was the idea of generating fissile material by human-made means. The third time that reactor was, by the way, the first fueling was 1957. The second fueling was 1965. It was an even stronger core. And the third fueling was in 1974, and that fueling was a thorium fueling. They actually fueled it with uranium-233, and they used a blanket of thorium, an outer blanket of thorium. The idea being that as the U-233 is undergoing the chain reaction, the stray neutrons will be producing even more uranium-233 in the blanket of thorium. And that's exactly the idea. The idea is that you just recycle and recycle and recycle. The nice thing about thorium reactors from the point of view of people who are enthusiastic about the future of nuclear energy is that it produces, each fission of uranium-233 produces more neutrons than the fissioning of uranium-235 or plutonium. In other words, it's an even more chain reacting element, if you want to put it that way. And because it produces so many extra neutrons, it produces almost as much fuel as it consumes, even without half trying. In fact, in 1977, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited here in Canada tried to persuade the government to spend billions of dollars building 2 reprocessing plants in Canada. The idea was to have one reprocessing plant to separate the plutonium out of the existing uranium fuel that we have and use it to spike thorium. So you would then have a second fueling of CANDU reactors using thorium spiked with plutonium, and then you would be able to harvest uranium-233. That's the second reprocessing plant. The second reprocessing plant would take the used thorium and extract U-233. Once you get that U-233 out, you can then use the U-233 instead of plutonium to spike more thorium rods. So as you go forward with more and more fuelings, you stop using plutonium and you use U-233. Now, the problem with U-233 is it's also a wonderful nuclear explosive. So it can make, in fact, the 1947 Atomic Energy of Canada Limited was instructed by the US military that when they started up their reactor here in Canada called the NRX reactor, that they not only use uranium rods, but they also use thorium rods. And that, believe it or not, at Chalk River, they actually built those small models of those 2 reprocessing plants, the one to extract plutonium, the other to extract uranium-233. That was back in the late 40s and early 50s. So Canada was in on this game very, very early on. And right now, there are countries in the world, such as China, one of the Scandinavian countries, I'm sorry, I don't momentarily remember who it is, and uh, and India, which are pursuing thorium reactors as a reality going forward. I'm going to stop here because the whole idea is to keep this short and allow for a lot of questions and answers. I've only skimmed the surface of this subject, but I'll make one final point. The defenders of thorium try to pretend that it's absolutely wonderfully free of problems. Not true. All of the problems associated with nuclear power are also true of thorium reactors. And an additional problem, you can't have thorium reactors without reprocessing. That means that people with thorium reactors automatically have access to weapons usable material. Now, it is pointed out that the U-233 that is produced in a thorium reactor is spiked with another uranium isotope, man-made, a human-made, called uranium-232, which is a very strong gamma emitter. But there's a way around that. People have known this for a long time. What you can do is you can harvest the precursor of uranium-233. This is a bit technical, but if you harvest a thing called protactinium-233, if you remove that before the U-232 builds up, you can get very pure uranium-233, excellent for weapons, without that disadvantage. So when anybody tells you that any of these problems are solved with thorium reactors, it's untrue. The high-level waste is still the same problem as ever. The weapons connection is still the same problem as ever, with a few little side notes, you might say. And the third problem is nuclear accidents of a catastrophic nature. Same problem. So we're not solving the problems here. We're probably making them more complicated and more dangerous in the long run. Thank you. Good questions.
Sure. I'm going to ask a question from Paul Mobley, seems to know a fair bit about this, and he's asking a kind of a technical question. His question was, does thorium have lower yields than U-235? And it's because it can be used for nuclear weapons. Does it produce lower yields?
By lower yields, I presume he means yield is an ambiguous word. Do you mean the yield of the power of the nuclear
The
weapon?
power, I believe, the power.
In fact, the U.S. Department of Energy exploded a, uh, but they did explode a uranium-233 bomb. And if you Google uranium-233, I think you'll find that it is recognized as being a very powerful nuclear explosive, that it's not a weak one at all.
Okay, could you just clarify? So, what you're saying is it is possible to run a thorium reactor, but it needs to be started either by reprocessing or at some point along the way. Does that mean every fuel load requires
No.
some element of reprocessed accompaniment as well?
Yes, it does, but not exactly as you might think. The first loading has got to have a fissile material in it, and that means you have to have access to separated plutonium that you can use as the starter, you might say, or rather highly enriched uranium. As I mentioned, the shipping port reactor actually started using 93% uranium, enriched uranium, in their first loading. So you have to start off with a weapons usable material to begin with, in order to get the thorium to breed uranium-233. Once you get the uranium-233, however, which you can only get by reprocessing the first batch, then you can use the U-233 instead of plutonium or instead of uranium. So once you get it going, and it might take several loadings before you have enough U-233 to make this work, because it's a slow process. But after several loadings, eventually you can go to a self-sustaining thorium cycle where you're using U-233 to breed more U-233.
Okay, so to your knowledge, you did mention some thorium reactors that had been operating historically. To your knowledge, are there thorium reactors, say, outside of a lab setting, actually producing power to a grid anywhere?
I'm not producing power to a grid, but very close to it. China has a thorium reactor, a molten salt. By the way, it's molten salt. The reason why they talk about molten salt, it's not necessary for a thorium reactor to have molten salt, but using molten salt makes it easier to breed more uranium-233. And molten salt is a coolant, unlike water, which is relatively transparent to neutrons. What that means is that the neutrons are not slowed down by passing through the coolant. So the molten salt doesn't slow the neutrons down the way water does. Water slows the neutrons down, and for that reason, it's called a moderator. When you have molten salt reactors, there's no moderator, and the result is you get much faster neutrons, and you get much greater yield, in a different sense of the word yield. You get a higher yield of uranium-233, a greater harvest, you might say. So molten salt and thorium often are mentioned in the same breath. They're not necessarily companions, but they often are thought that way. And in fact, at Oak Ridge National Laboratories in Tennessee, Alvin Weinberg ran a molten salt reactor on an experimental basis, a very prototype thing for a number of years. And he also was a big fan of the thorium cycle, as it's called. So thorium is not a scam. It's a genuine thing, but it's presented in more glorious colors than it should be. There are some advantages to thorium. One of the greatest advantages that people point out is that it does not produce plutonium. And there's sort of big smile on their face, say, hey, with thorium reactors, you get no plutonium. Yeah, but you get U-233, which is even more powerful than plutonium as a nuclear explosive. So it's really not something to rejoice over. It's something to realize as a switch. It's a switch. Instead of producing plutonium, we're producing something else, which is equally proliferation prone, provided you handle it carefully, just like plutonium.
Are the power stations using thorium exactly the same as those for U-235? They just use different fuel rods? Like, are they the same type of?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, basically, all nuclear reactors are basically just designed to boil water. That's it. So they boil water, and once you boil the water, you get steam and you generate electricity just the way you would exactly as in a coal plant or an oil-fired plant. You know, there's no difference really. It's just another way of boiling water. So as far as the electricity production, it really doesn't matter what fuel or coolant you're using. The difference between the use of fuel and the use of coolant is in the proliferation risks, and is in the radioactivity, and is in the accident potentials, and is in the high-level radioactive waste and low-level radioactive waste problems that are created. So the choice of fuel has no bearing on the electricity production itself.
Okay, great. Okay, so question from Ann Lindsay, who's asking, at what point does the thorium fuel become waste? It cannot continue to be used in a reactor.
Yeah, that's debatable. There's something happens with all fuel. This is with all nuclear fuels, regardless of what it is, thorium or. And by the way, I object to the use of thorium as a fuel. It's not really a fuel. It's a fertile source of fuel. The fuel is really uranium. The fuel is really uranium-233, not thorium. So when they talk about thorium as a fuel, they're stretching the English language a little bit out of shape. But you understand, of course, what it is. Now, with all nuclear reactors, no matter what the fuel is, you get hundreds of radioactive byproducts called fission products, many hundred, probably more than 1,000 of them. And these are the broken pieces of uranium or thorium or uranium or plutonium atoms. When these atoms are fissioned, they break into smaller pieces. Usually it's around 1/3, 2/3. One piece is usually about twice as big as the other piece. And these are called the fission products, and they are fiercely radioactive. And that happens no matter what the fuel is. And that's the bulk of the radioactive material. That's the stuff that causes nuclear reactors to melt down. Because the heat from that radioactivity that has been created, that radioactivity cannot be turned off, and therefore that so-called decay heat cannot be turned off. And that's what leads to overheating of the reactor and melting of the core of the reactor. That's a fact. So you can't get away from the fact that you're producing this waste. Now, when you reprocess, what you do is you segregate the fissile material from the non-fissile material. It's the non-fissile material that is really the waste. And that's what still is there, and it's still high-level waste, and it's still going to be dangerous for millions of years, and it's got to be put deep underground. The thorium reactor does have some advantages. The lifetime of the waste is somewhat ameliorated. because it does not produce plutonium. That means and the higher actinides, as they're called, things that are heavier than plutonium. Because those are not produced in a thorium reactor to the same degree, the longevity of the thorium waste is a little shorter. So instead of 10 million years, it might be 5 million years, but it's still very, very long. It's not a qualitative difference.
Okay. So this one's about, okay. Can you talk about where the greatest deposits of thorium occur and any problems associated with mining thorium?
Well, thorium, like uranium, has a lot of radioactive so-called decay products. And there's about a dozen decay products of uranium-238. So when you bring uranium to the surface, you bring along a dozen radioactive byproducts, and those byproducts are left in the waste. So when you extract uranium, you're only taking away 15% of the radioactivity of the ore, and you're leaving 85% of the radioactivity behind in the waste tailings. And that becomes, we have in Canada over 225 million tons of radioactive tailings left over from uranium mining. Huge, huge piles. And they're going to be dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. So now thorium is very similar. It also has a decay chain. And when you mine thorium, you leave behind the waste, the decay products of thorium, but those are shorter lived, qualitatively different. But there is undeniably somewhat of an improvement in the sense that the decay products are shorter lived, and but not so much shorter lived that it stops to be a problem. It's in human terms, it's much the same problem. Now, thorium deposits are abundant. Thorium is about 3 times as abundant as uranium in the Earth's crust, and when you mine rare earths, people talk about the strategic minerals, including the so-called rare earths, which are also called lanthanides. Those are almost always rich in thorium. They are associated with thorium. So you get thorium as a byproduct coming out of the rare earth mines, and not only thorium, but also uranium. So both uranium and thorium are usually commingled with the rare earths, which is one of the reasons why rare earth mining is extraordinarily dangerous. And here in Canada, we do not have an apparatus. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission does not have the job of supervising non-uranium ores. So if they were actually mining thorium, then I think the CNSC would be involved. But if they're mining rare earths and it happens to have thorium, they basically wash their hands and say, well, that's not our problem. That's not our mandate. So there is a problem here. There's a loophole in looking after here in Oka, just outside of Montreal. We have radioactive waste left over from niobium mining. Down in Varennes, just south of Montreal, we have uranium tailings left over from phosphate fertilizer plant, the Urco phosphate fertilizer plant. And we have had hundreds and hundreds of homes and buildings, and even much of our highways have been built using radioactive waste sold by private companies as construction material, who are unaware, in some cases, unaware of the dangers, and in some cases just don't care about the dangers. But these are radon generating waste, so that when they build homes, the homes end up having extraordinarily high levels of radon in them, which is very deadly, as a result of radioactive building materials.
Right. So a question from Paul. Are thorium reactors safer to operate than reactors such as GE Mark I reactors in terms of cooling and core meltdowns potentially occurring?
Yeah, actually, this is one of the claims with thorium reactors is that they often call them meltdown proof, because the idea is that what Alvin Weinberg wanted to do was he wanted to have the fuel itself in a liquid form. He didn't want to have solid fuel that could melt. He wanted to have molten fuel to begin with. So if the fuel is liquid to begin with, then you can't talk about a meltdown because it's liquid already. The whole idea of a meltdown is that the melting point of uranium oxide, which is used in our current reactors, is around 2,500 degrees Celsius. I don't have the right number, but let's say it's around that. Once it gets up to that temperature, the fuel melts. And what's wrong with the fuel melting is that it releases the radioactive contents of the fuel. So that all the radioactive contents, the strontium, the iodine, the radioactive cesium, gets emitted as vapors, and you get a cloud of radioactivity going downwind from there. That's what happened at Chernobyl. That's what happened at Fukushima. Um, with thorium reactors, they're liquid fuel to begin with, and so the fission products are treated in the coolant without getting to any kind of catastrophe point where the whole structure starts melting down. They claim it's meltdown proof. I'm not sure if I 100% believe that, but it certainly is true that that is considered to be an advantage. I would mention that thorium metal also has a very high melting point, much higher than uranium. So even if you were using solid uranium fuel, as Atomic Energy of Canada Limited wanted to do, they just wanted to use fuel bundles made of thorium, just like the current solid fuel bundles made of uranium. They didn't want to use a new reactor. They just wanted to use the CANDU reactors. They said CANDU reactors can be made into what they called near breeders. If you go to the thorium cycle, there's so many neutrons, extra neutrons flying around that you can be a near breeder. It almost produces more weight. It almost produces as much fuel as it uses. So you can see the attraction from the point of view of nuclear engineering of this state. But of course, oftentimes they don't really think about the dangers as being insuperable. They figure that whatever dangers there are, we can certainly plan for them and avoid them. I'm not so sanguine in that respect.
Okay, so now a question from Gordon Delzell, and he's asking about, okay, is it correct that Canada played a role in the development of a nuclear bomb in India as the
No.
result of India building their own nuclear reactor using CANDU reactor technology? He's wondering, would thorium have been involved in this?
No, no. Well, India is in fact very interested in thorium. They are trying to move to a thorium cycle. The Canadian reactor technology using heavy water lends itself very nicely to thorium use. It turns out that the Canadian reactor design, which uses heavy water as a moderator and natural uranium as fuel, is particularly well adapted to using the thorium cycle. And our Canadian nuclear scientists have always kind of yearned for permission to be able to move to the thorium cycle. That's what they tried to do in 1977. And our organization, CCNR, actually blew the whistle on that. And at that moment that they wanted to do that, there was a Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning taking place in Ontario. And the Royal Commission found out through us that they were secretly planning to do this behind the backs of the commission without telling the commissioners about their plans. And when we revealed that, it basically put the kibosh on the plan. So we can take some credit for stopping reprocessing perhaps at that moment in time. But reprocessing is still the dream of almost all nuclear technologists who are genuinely committed to the idea of thousands of years of nuclear power. They say that we got to go to reprocessing. We got to start using plutonium as a fuel, and we got to start expanding the fuel base by using thorium, which is 3 times more abundant. Otherwise, we're going to run out of uranium and it's going to fizzle.
Okay. Question from Ole Hendrickson. Is radon from the thorium-232 decay chain less of a health hazard than the radon from the uranium-238 decay chain?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Ole. It turns out that I mentioned to you that the uranium decay chain involves some of the deadliest substances we know. Radium, which killed a lot of people in the 20th century, radon, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people, and polonium, which has killed also hundreds of thousands of people every year, in fact, through smoking, because smoking polonium-210 ends up in the tobacco and ends up being one of the major causes of death in cigarette smoking. So, and that's a byproduct of uranium. So many people don't know that every atom of radon comes from uranium. Radon-222, that's called. Now, with thorium, you also get the same materials, radium, radon, polonium, but they have shorter half-lives, much shorter half-lives. And so radon-220, which comes from the thorium fuel chain, is just like radon-222, but it's got a much shorter half-life. Radon-222 from uranium has a 3.8-day half-life. Radon-220 has a half-life of only a few minutes. Anyway, it's gone a lot quicker. And consequently, it doesn't have time to build up in homes and in basements as much as the other radon, the heavier radon. And so for that reason, it's not as hazardous. But when it's breathed in, it's the same problem. It's the same problem. It's very dangerous to the lungs. The main danger when you breathe in radon, by the way, is that not only is it a gas, but it also disintegrates rapidly, producing solid byproducts of polonium. And it's the polonium that's lodged in the lung when you breathe radon. It's the polonium that's left in the lungs that really does the damage. 85% of the damage done to the lungs is from the polonium isotopes. And so radon can be thought of as a delivery system of polonium.
This is Nancy Covington. You mentioned thorium occurs with other rare earths and also uranium. Does it ever occur in a purer form by itself?
That's a good question. I think it does. I think thorium deposits are largely just thorium deposits. And thorium, unlike uranium, is a pretty well a monoisotopic. In other words, there's only one isotope of thorium when you find a big deposit of thorium. It's thorium-232. And that's the stuff that changes into protactinium-233, which in turn changes into uranium-233. So generally speaking, thorium is only the one isotope, whereas uranium is a mixture of isotopes.
Gordon did not yet answer his own question. Is thorium a game changer or hype?
Good question. Yeah. It's a bit of both. It's a game changer from the point of view of the nuclear enthusiasts. All they need is the green light, and they regard it as a game changer. From the point of view of practical politics, it could be regarded as hype in the sense that, it's why did SNC-Lavalin change its name to Atkins-Realis? Because SNC-Lavalin had a bad reputation. It had a stench about it. And so they changed their name. That's what I believe anyway. And in the same way, I think the nuclear industry feels that conventional large nuclear reactors have developed a kind of a stench because of Fukushima and Chernobyl and all that. And so let's pretend that we have a trouble-free nuclear technology. And every time they introduce something that people are unfamiliar with, they can claim that it's brand new and it's trouble-free and it solves all the problems, even though these things were known long, long ago, as long as we've known about any of the other things. That's why I emphasized in my talk that we've known about thorium reactors for a long time. There's nothing new conceptually about thorium reactors, and even in practice. So in that sense, it's hype. In that sense, it's hype intended to deceive decision makers as well as the public. If they were perfectly honest about it, they would say it's got the same problems, but you know what? It's got a few advantages. They are genuinely a few advantages. And it also extends the fuel base by a considerable amount. We call ourselves the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. We don't call ourselves the Canadian Coalition Against Nuclear Energy or against nuclear science, because we think that the fundamental problem politically is that these nuclear protagonists, the nuclear proponents, just can't afford to tell the whole truth. If they just told the whole truth, then at least people would know what they're getting into. And so we have been trying to counter the, I quote unquote, lies of the nuclear industry. They're not exactly lies, they're half-truths, but half-truths turn out to be lies. And so we try to counter the half-truths of the nuclear industry by providing a fuller picture of what the problems are.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Susan. It was great to pick your brain on this very, technical issue. I know I'm going to have to watch the webinar again, and we will send the link out to everybody. And stay tuned for future webinars with Gordon coming up soon. Thank you, everybody, for your participation. What a intensive chat bar there was there, and maybe we'll even try to answer some of your questions.